than Saint Bonaventure. I do not want to do a genealogy, but a simple anatomy of this apophaticism in Middle Ages. Let me begin with a quotation from C.S. Lewis and his famous discarded image. At his most characteristic, medieval man was not a dreamer nor a wanderer. He was an organizer, a codifier, a builder of systems. He wanted a place for everything and everything in the right place. Distinction, definition, tabulation were his delight. Though full of turbulent activities, he was equally full of the impulse to formalize them. There was nothing which medieval people liked better or did better than sorting out and tidying up. Of all of modern inventions, I suspect that they would most have admired the card index. Lewis's diagnosis resonates to some extent with Thomas Aquinas' famous definition of the peculiarity of his own era of thought as distinct from patristic in terms of a reasoned and systematic elaboration of data taken from the fathers. If these statements are correct, and the fundamental question arises whether any true apophatic theology can be found in medieval theology at all. Recent studies, and we have a lot of them, show that apophatic or negative theology, I am here on the side of Julia. I dislike very much the name of negative theology, so I prefer to use apophatic theology. The studies show that apophatic theology was at the very heart of the medieval vision of knowledge about God. They proved that the predilection to catalog and systematize knowledge, including theological knowledge, does not exclude cognitive humility and awareness of the limitations of cognition. Perhaps this statement, which affirms the blending of sublime systematic speculation and apophaticism, goes to the very heart of medieval thinking about God and the world in relation to him. It is not possible in such a short presentation to provide some exhaustive study of the many themes inherent in medieval apophaticism. Let us begin our journey with the author, who is perhaps least likely to be suspected of thinking in apophatic terms, but on the contrary is often accused of essential rationalism, Anselm of Canterbury. In defining God as id quod maius cogitari nequit, Anselm deals with an apophatic approach to his mystery. His essence is not defined here in any way. Following Butler-Fellner's interpretation, the center of Anselm's argument is precisely this mysterious name of God. This is the quotation. Through this name, Anselm has made both affirmations and denials concerning God problematic, if not impossible. Anselm shows that language can never offer a final and complete formulation for God, and he does so through his own name for God, something than which nothing greater can be thought. A name that remains brilliantly open and which is ingenious, not for what it affirms about God, but rather for what it denies. This becomes clear a little further down in chapter 15 of the Proslogion, where Anselm describes God as something greater than can be thought. Ergo domine non solum est quo maius cogitari nequit, sed est quidam maius quam cogitari possit. I would like to do a little bypass now and to go to the interpretation of Michel Corbin, a French Jesuit who dedicated his life to Saint Anselm. I think I found his interpretation very brilliant and very, very beautiful as well spiritually. In his view, the Anselmian argument is not merely about metaphysical speculation, but about essential theological truth. For Corbin, that being over which no greater can be conceived, that which sets the limits of what can be conceived, is God in his paschal revelation on the cross of Christ and in the resurrection. Corben asks, qualified negatively by the impossibility of being inscribed within the framework of our possibilities, noetically by the prohibition of placing our thought above it, can this something, it, differ from what the apostle calls this, who is the foolishness of God and what is weakness of God? Can he designate anything other than the Passover of God, the event of divine superabundance through the wounds of Jesus, crucified out of mad love for us? I mean, it makes me absolutely happy, this sentence. This is the very heart of theology. And Michel Corbin did the same, not only, I mean, he started with Anselm, but he did the same with Gregor of Nyssa and with his Oratio Catechetica Magna, which is for him a Paschal oration. And then now, this year, he published a book on Dionysius Areopagite, precisely on the same topic, the interpretation of the divine names in the Paschal hermeneutics, or from this perspective. Let me go to the second point, mystical element of apophatic theology, itinerarium of desire. This is my beloved Bonaventure. The second example I will use to describe medieval apophaticism will be Bonaventure's small work, Itinerarium, influenced to the great extent by Areopagite. The Itinerarium deals with the knowledge of God seen integrally from the perspective of his diverse presence in the world and in man. The main stages of the journey are marked by gradations of successive levels, starting from the traces through the image to the contemplation of God in himself from the perspective of his unity and goodness. Unity, it is a substantial perspective. Goodness is a Trinitarian perspective. Bonum diffusivum sui est. To consider God through his name good, it means directly a Trinitarian consideration. The journey begins outside of man, in the encounter with the created world as vestigium. The second fundamental stage is marked by entering into oneself and viewing God in his created imago, mens. What a beautiful concept, mens, Augustinian, but not only. The third part of the journey leads the mens above itself towards the contemplation of unity and Trinity in God. Here, in fact, the journey ends, although the mystery, in its proper sense, has only just opened. What opens here, Bonaventure says, is the promise of entering into rest. We are all expecting vacations now. So this huge eschatological vacations, I mean, at the end of the Itinerarium, he says, if it is true what I said, let us dream to die and to enter this peace of the Trinitarian life. So this is the quotation from Saint Bonaventure. Nor does anything more remain save the day of rest, on which by the elevation of the mind, mens, its insight rests from all work which he had done, in qua per mentis excessum requiescat humane mentis. This is very curious. Through excessum mentis, we rest. I mean, this is extremely difficult job to be done, and at the same time, marking the true rest for all of us. Entry into this rest is accomplished through the crucified Christ. Once again, Paschal mystery. Who is the vehicle, he says. Yes, he says, Bonaventure says, Christ crucified is a vehicle, is a car, which leads us from this world to the Father. In this passage, Bonaventure reminds, if it is perfect, all intellectual operations should be abandoned. Oportet quod relinquantur omnes intellectuales operationes. What does it mean? It is a postmodern rejection of reason. It is a kind of anti-intellectual vision of Franciscans who always preferred birds and nature and ecology or whatever else. Not really. Let us note this significant expression about necessity of leaving all intellectual activities. Probably you remember that for the medievals, there was a distinction between passive and active intellect. So this is this is a little bit my own interpretation. What Bonaventure says, once the itinerarium is finished, because we cannot go anymore in this world by ourselves, absolutely impossible. We can only desire. And desiring God, we can enter into the unity of will and intellect with Christ. And in this precisely moment, itinerarium is the itinerarium of speculations, intellectual speculations. Saint Francis for Bonaventure, who is the hero of this treatise, is a man of speculation, vir desiderium, but as well theologian and a believer who was made a theology in person through his own crucifixion, through stigmatization. So I think that what Bonaventure says is very simple. Now there is no place. It is impossible for our active intellect to work. We can only gaze, we can only listen, we can only be taken into the mystery. And everything through the crucified Christ. Maybe here is the very nerve of apophaticism, crucifixion. You have to put silence to all your human desires, a kind of negation of oneself just in order to find yourself or oneself once again, but not from myself, but from God, from the Trinitarian revelation on the cross. It is my conviction that the itinerarium is an expression of the Bonaventurian conception of theology. You know, sometimes people say this is a late work of Bonaventure written after 1259, when he already was a general of the Franciscan and not fully professor in Paris. So we have to treat this as a spiritual treatise. I would say that this is, I will tell you what I heard from Professor Saragnana in Pamplona, who had his thesis on Bonaventure. It was in 60s, if I remember well. I don't remember it, I was sad. So I was born in 74, so no way. Saragnana has written a letter asking, something to Gilson, who dedicated a whole monography to Saint Bonaventure. And he received a response from Gilson, and Gilson very politely was saying, "Dear Father, I am so very happy that you work on Bonaventure. I have to tell you that I am a very old man. I do not remember too much, but I can tell you, and I can assure you of one thing. During my whole life, there was only one book which was on my desk, which was night desk, whatever it is, when you have your stuff. It was Itinerarium of Bonaventure. This great Thomist said, I admire Itinerarium. This is probably one of the greatest treatises of theology which combine theology and spirituality ever. Very short, but very beautiful. So I think that this is, mainly that his idea, mature idea, according to, I think that it was a huge turn in Bonaventure work after Alvernia, 1959. Everything changed in him completely. And he expressed his idea of theology in Itinerarium. If you should ask now these things, how these things come about, question grace, not instruction, desire, not intellect, the cry of prayer, nor pursuit of study, the spouse, not the teacher, God, not man, darkness, not clarity, not light, but the holy flaming fire, which will bear you aloft to God with fullest unction and burning affection. As can be seen, Bonaventure here shifts the entire burden of theological reflection from concepts and day systematization toward lived experience. Here we can clearly see a characteristic feature of Franciscanism in the final emphasis on the act of will. In no way does this imply an anti-intellectualism. Moreover, Bonaventure suggests, far from rejecting it, that the whole apparatus of theology is in fact at the service of sustaining our desire for God. And this is the true apophaticism of Bonaventure. Let me turn, to make the stuff a little bit shorter, to St. Thomas Aquinas. We now have several detailed studies of the issue of apophasis in the Corpus Thomisticum. Rocca, Umbrecht have examined the use of negative theology in Thomas's teaching on God. In this perspective, I would like to emphasize the connection between Thomas's theory of cognition and paradox. St. Thomas points out that salvation is fundamentally related to vision, seeing, and knowing. Visio Dei, viewing the unveiled essence of God, visio Dei per essentiam, is man's ultimate destiny. St. Thomas realizes that the possibility of a beatific vision finds its theological root in the salvific revelation made by Christ. The relation to the Word is decisive in the vision of God, since the Word is the source of this vision. The Word, Christ, is the source of the vision of God. It is indeed important that this emphasis, here you see why I don't want to do a genealogy, because we can quarrel without end. Where is this apophaticism of medieval authors coming from? And this is senseless a little. It is very interesting, but it's senseless. Their theology comes from Christ, from seeing, loving, relating to Christ. Of course, because they love Christ, and Christ is a universal logos, they enter into dialogue with every culture, and if every little logos spermaticos, wherever they can find it. It is indeed important that this emphasis on the possibility of knowing God co-occurs in Thomas along with elements of apophatic theology expressed in the famous axiom, the ultimate knowledge of God is the knowledge that man cannot know God. Quod stiat se Deum nescire. This apophatic cognition, I'm sorry, this technology always makes me perplexed. This apophatic cognition that locates the knower at the limits of cognition is the intuition that God has unveiled, revealed, still transcends everything, including the human intellect. The combination of an affirmation of the possibility of knowing God, visio Dei, with an apophatic awareness, quod stiat senestire, of divine transcendence, found in Thomas, seems at first glance to be an incongruity. More than incongruity and lack of logic, however, it is an introduction to paradox. Salvation is a gift, not of this world, and as such it's always paradoxical. An integral paradoxical does not mean without logic. Paradoxical means conjecture, a saturation of truth, which is perceived for us for the first time as a kind of darkness, paradox. An integral part of it is the opening of the possibility of knowing God. This possibility opens on the basis of transformation, a transformation of the knowing subject in such a way that in himself he can see the reflection of divine magnificence. Non igitur potest intellectus creatus Deum per essentiam videre. nisi in quantum Deus per suam gratiam se intellectui creato coniungit, ut intelligibile ab ipso. And you know, I mean, this is Bonaventure and Thomas, they are friends and brothers in this moment. What says Saint Bonaventure is, I am thinking about my master and the founder of my order, Saint Francis, and what can I see in him? A man who theologized, not in the very academic way, but his writings are a true theology. And at the end of his life, he was made an icon, or he was put by the Holy Spirit and Christ crucified into the icon, as St. Paul says, into the icon of Christ. So he was made a living, experienced theology. St. Thomas says about the same. He says that God unites himself to our intellect. He becomes forma mentis for us, to know God by similitudinous, to God through, there is a Latin name, no, I don't forget it, connaturalitas. Of course, there is no connaturalitas between God and man, but we are assimilated, we participating in the divine mystery, in his nature, in his very nature, metexis, metousia, as Saint Peter would have it. And there is another trace in St. Thomas Aquinas, which is very interesting for me, his Trinitarian theology, which probably seemed to be the most elevated and most speculative and most beautiful part of his theology. So he does whatever he can just in order to explicate, to show how the main patristic ideas, concepts for the Trinity, especially from the Cappadocians, how they work, but asked what is the reason for his Trinitarian theology. He doesn't say, I want to make this mystery clear. Do you know what he says? 3 things. I do my Trinitarian theology in order to help us to understand our beginning, where we are coming from, and to understand what is before us, what we are destined for. I mean, this is reasonable. He knows that he cannot make one world, one simple word, one beautiful system without exception to show who God is. He only talking about the revelation, he wants to explain our past and our future, our destiny, the whole essence of our future life. You know, we sometimes make this, especially now in this postmodern time, a lot of problems and a lot of melancholia. There is no hope among us. So that's why all these very sophisticated thinkers of postmodern era, Badiou, Derrida, they all were waiting for a kind of apocalypse, a very strong event which will turn the destiny of history. Or, I mean, we are expecting this the same. Sometimes in what we are talking about the reform in the church, we are very, we create a new apocalypse. What should we do in order to save church or to reform it? This is not the way here. This is just to open every one of us and everybody to the perspective of the participation in God, not apocalypses, not a dramatic event against us, not destruction, not melancholy, just hope. He's waiting for us. He is a community. He wanted us because he is community. And he opens before us every day, more and more, the possibility of the full participation, of our full participation in his Trinitarian life. Of course, here I could and it would be very interested to address the subject of the quarrel between the only true quarrel between Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas. It was about God the Father. Instabilitas. Is it negative tantum, as St. Thomas wishes, that God the Father has not the beginning, is proceeding from nobody? For Thomas Aquinas, it meant that this is only a negative feature of God the Father characteristic. For Saint Bonaventure, negativa, this negativity was interpreted in a positive way. Inestabilitas means for Bonaventure plenitudo fontalis. But I cannot enter this because this is very, detailed question, very beautiful. Maybe I will do it in the written version of this paper. Let me go to the finish of this paper. The fourth point is, the title is The Demise of Apophaticism in Nominalism. What do I want to stress by this a little bit enigmatic title? Participation and analogy. Anselm, Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, they all presupposed the analogical perspective in theology. And analogy was, is still the most important feature of how to understand the use of negative or apophatic theology. And you know why analogy is so very important? Because of the participation, where we really believe that we are destined for the participation in Trinitarian life, our language becomes analogical. Whereas the rejection of participation, of the possibility of participation, there has to be a rejection of the analogical. Whereas the rejection of analogical, there has to be rejection of apophatic theology. And here you have Duns Scotus. He's insurpassably positive in his theology. He really thinks that he can explain everything to make it clear. And in this regard, I would say that he's proto-modern thinker. Olivier Boulnois, in his Être et Représentation, his famous thesis on Duns Scotus and the second beginning of metaphysics in 14th century, puts it very clear. So I think that this is the very nerve of the apophatism in the medieval period. Christ crucified, who enables our participation, intellectual, volitive, existential, in the life of God. That's why, when we are introduced to the very inner life of God, the picture which we can see is so beautiful and overwhelming that we need analogy. We understand that we can have only a part, partem capere, participare, not to see everything, but to see only a limited part of everything. Humility. Deification, deiformitas, through crucified Christ, are entering with the passive mysticism, theology, analogy, everything here is brought together. This is why, please let me to finish. Few conclusions. First, apophatic thinking marks one of the essential dimensions of medieval theology, without question, for me at least. Second, the medieval apophatic strategy is primarily concerned with the possibility of union with God. The authors analyze no dialectic between the three ways: purifying, negating, and elevating. Theology as such serves the purpose of union with God. Third, and this is the reason why I do not touch Meister Eckhart here. Union with God is accomplished through Christ. His life and work are an essential point in our knowledge of God and in our participation in God. Christ then provides the framework for using the apophatic strategy in theology. He does not refute it, but puts it in its proper place. His crucifixion is a true apophatic theology, which enables our participation in God, intellectually, willingly, directly. Christ's role should not be reduced to the mere example, as it is in Eckhart, as well as Christology to any transcendental endeavor. And the fourth, seen from this perspective, medieval theology is not some kind of game or intellectual play. Well, we have a spare time, so let's do the calculus of concepts and see what's going on. But an exercise of mind. Our mind has to be purified. This is very similar. Gilles Emery interprets in this way the Trinitarian theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. He says this is a spiritual exercise. Not intent to say everything and to make clear everything. St. Thomas Aquinas do not want to dissolve the mystery. He wants to expose the mystery as a mystery. It is apophatic theology, assimilation into the mystery that makes union and participation possible. Theology, comprising apophatic, is the way of life. Ultimately, this is why medieval apophaticism should not be reduced to a mere inert system of thought, a fragment of an attempt to enclose God in more perfect because purified concepts. We can say, I negate it, so now I know better. No, this is not Cusanus, but he's beyond my area. He says, you have to negate the positive and you have to negate negation as well in order to get the non-aliud. So theology is a way of life, apophatic theology, and should not be reduced to a mere inert system of thought, a fragment of an attempt to enclose God in more perfect because purified concepts, or a kind of theological calculation. This is important because many of the modern references to medieval apophaticism only enclose it within the boundaries of some rigid conceptual system without reference to the totality in which apophaticism actually appeared in the space of medieval thinking. Such reduction and lack of complete insight often lead to the transformation of theological themes into nihilistic systems of thought that emphasize either the non-existence of truth or its absolute inaccessibility. Claude Bruard said, apophaticism, only one step to atheism. Why did he say that? Not because he saw this in the Fathers or in the medieval period, but he saw it in Derrida, in Vattimo, that their use of apophaticism is maybe not the atheism, but the one step before atheism. Neither of these options, nihilism, rejection of truth, lack of trust in the intellect and will, neither of these options was of interest to medieval thinkers who were astonished by the self-gift of Trinitarian God in Christ crucified and the transformation and the transformed light which springs from it. Thank you very much.